Hello, and welcome to another cover seminar. Today is the first time, and perhaps the only ever time, that I'm going to get to both welcome someone who is the principal of a financial institution, but also one which is where a reserve has actually managed to win an art prize. So that's an unusual combination. So here we have Charles Lewis, who is one of the principals of the NSK State Reserve, and he's going to chat with us about this interesting combination of financial institutions, non-territorial states, and art projects, or something of that nature. We'll have to see where it goes, okay? So I'm just going to hand it over to Charles and say thanks for coming along.
Awesome, Stephen. Thank you for putting this together. Is there any way to, is there like a chat or something we can have up? There is a chat here. What I'd like to find out is just sort of like what people's backgrounds are and what they might want to focus on. So there are a lot of ways that this could go. This is a currency project. It does like focus on interrogation of financial concepts. So we could definitely talk about financial things. It is an art project with physical objects, so we could talk about the art creation. But most of all, it's going to be like the story of how these things got conflated in this project. So I don't know if anyone can communicate with the chat, but just let me know if there's any messages up there, and I'd be happy to. I guess I'm saying jump in anytime to anyone in the audience who wants to like ask anything or redirect or anything like that. Okay, so I'll start by sharing. Second, sorry. Set it up, and yep, it's up. Oh, Dr. Gobantsova, thank you. Let me out here. Back to this. F5. Oh no, Alexei, hello. It's good to see you.
Hey, hello.
How are you?
I'm fine. Couldn't make it to London, so this will have to do.
It's still great to see you. Where are you now?
Still in Istria.
I mean physically.
Oh, in my headquarters.
Awesome. So Alexei's in a bunker.
With a window.
With a window, with a view. Okay, so now you should be able to see the slides, and we can start with that. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So if anybody does want to, like I said, dig into anything, we can do this. So I don't know how much background anybody has in NSK, so I will try to do the highlights of this art collective that we have sort of derived our work from without spending 3 hours on it, which you could easily do and have done. So to understand the NSK State Reserve, to understand where it comes from, we first might ask, what is NSK? What do these letters stand for? They stand for Neue Slowenische Kunst, New Slovenian Art, which was an art collective in Slovenia that was established in 1984. And Alexei, you can jump in if I make any egregious factual errors. You might notice that the name of it, although it was in Slovenia, is in German. A lot of what they did was going back and sort of examining historical roots of trauma, things that had gone before, and sort of appropriating elements from them to sort of reintroduce them into their current frame. The NSK collective itself was actually a meta collective composed of a number of other already existing collectives. There was a fine arts collective called Irwin. There was a theater collective called Scipion Niceus Sisters Theater. And some of you might be familiar with Leibach, who was and still is a musical group. These collectives already existed, were already doing work, and came together to form this meta collective called New Slovenian Art. As I mentioned, a lot of their work involved appropriating things from appropriating historical elements from Slovenian history, things that had ideological weight, and sort of bringing them into the frame of what they were working on. Again, I don't want to spend hours talking about NSK, but one important thing that I want to get across is that it was called New Slovenian Art. with the emphasis on Slovenian, and that they were formed at a time in the 80s when there was often sort of a shift in what they were like supposed to be doing as state artists, whether it was initially in Yugoslavia, they were supposed to be working, have their eyes to the east towards Russia and the USSR, and working in that sort of mode, or towards the west, doing things in the sort of modern art mode that was going on at that time. And so the NSK was supposed to be, hey, how about we actually look at what's going on here in our current context and working on this. And that's the Slovenian in the middle of Neue Slowenisch. This collective existed for many years. What ultimately occurred was that in the 90s, Yugoslavia itself, as we're probably aware, dissolved. The country had a horrific war, and Yugoslavia as a country ceased to exist. I've never heard them express it exactly this way, but I think that for NSK, for that collective, this presented a sort of crisis of identity, because a lot of what they did was in dialogue with the state itself. A lot of what they did was provocation. Just having their name in German in a country that had fought the Germans and been invaded by the Germans many times was a provocation. And without this interlocutor, I think that there might have been a little bit of an almost artistic crisis of like, okay, what do we do without this? And so some elements of NSK actually went out and started talking to artists in other countries, in Russia, in New York, trying to determine what direction art could take at this point. And they started doing this, and they started calling these embassies. They started setting up temporary embassies in these places in order to have these almost diplomatic relations with artists in other countries. So in this sense, they started to take on some functions of state. And as Yugoslavia itself dissipated, NSK continued to do these embassies and take on these sort of functions, ultimately printing their own passports. People had Yugoslavian passports, which ceased to mean anything. And so the NSK collective printed passports, which were printed by a printer who made real passports. So they were physically identical to actual passports at that time, and distributed them. And they distributed hundreds of these. Last night at a presentation we did, we saw a movie about an embassy that they set up in Sarajevo while Sarajevo was under siege. And they distributed hundreds of these passports to the citizens of Sarajevo, so that they would have some sort of identity. There was tremendous interest in having these. So at this point, you have this collective going on to this project where they're actually assuming roles of the state. And they eventually gave it a name, and they called it the NSK State. Alexei, I won't go into, originally I think that was meant to be an internal club of the artists themselves. Eventually with the passports, I think it might have just sort of flown a little bit out of control and taken on a little bit of a life of its own. I say here that there's over 15,000 citizens worldwide. I think I've been seeing that number for about 10 years now. So I have no idea what any kind of recent count of this would be. You can still get a passport. You can still become a member of this virtual state. And it was created as a virtual state, as a state without borders, that only existed in time, was the sort of tagline of it. So this is the foundation that we're working from. This is sort of the context for creating a reserve. It's within this virtual state that was created, I don't want to be over dramatic, in the embers of burning Yugoslavia. Basically, as Yugoslavia was breaking up, and they created this virtual state. So what I've skipped over here, I'm jumping right to 2015 when we formed the reserve. But in a pivotal thing that I don't have up here right now is that in 2010, since Alexei's here, I will absolutely give him a shout out. In 2010, Alexei organized a NSK Citizens Congress in Berlin at the House of World Cultures. And this brought together a lot of these citizens worldwide to actually meet each other and talk about the state and make decisions about the state, and really to meet each other, to start organizing more. And from this, myself, David Kay, our other principal, who's also here, met and became much more involved in NSK activities, NSK State activities. And what this ultimately resulted in for us was the creation of the NSK State Reserve. One of the things that was discussed, I think, at the Congress and that had a big role in this was what came out of this was that one of the things that NSK did was that they created this sort of toolkit for interrogating ideas, for interrogating ideologies, for interrogating government for functions. It was a toolkit that included appropriation, taking things from the past, taking things from other contexts, taking things with a lot of ideological weight, appropriating them and using them in new contexts in art, which often was provocative. It was a toolkit that included collectivism. Again, this was originally a collective of collectives, and often this was used to a sort of anonymizing effect, where behind this notion of like a state apparatus, they would create this art and then issue it as a product of that apparatus, of that product of each one of these collectives. So there is a strong element of collectivism here. What we decided in creating the reserve was that we weren't going to try to repeat what had already been done. What we were really interested in is if this is truly a toolkit, we should try applying it. We should take it and apply it to things in our context and the sort of institutions and zeitgeist, that we're currently in, and seeing what happens. Seeing what that does turn up. So for this reason, being I myself am in New York, David's in New Haven, being in this place and time in the United States, it is, especially in New York, just very steeped in finance. And I myself at the time had just started a job at a big institution and was sort of learning all those things for the first time as well. So the overlay of these ideas was just very immediate and something that we thought could be applied. And so for this reason, in the same sense that there were already institutions in the NSK State, there was an organogram that showed how each one of the collectives related, had a different role. There's the Department of Pure and Applied Philosophy. We wanted to create such an institution specifically to be a central banking institution, to interrogate notions of finance and that apparatus, and to look at it through the lens with these tools that were originally pioneered through NSK. What would this institution do? Our first notion was that, and I'm going to say the word naively a lot in this. A lot of what we've done was just sort of like, I guess we try this and see what happens. The first thing that we would do would be to try to create money. Basically to generate a currency that citizens could have, that they could use to actually communicate. We started out by looking at the notion of currency, what maybe one of the things that NSK does, or certainly Leibach does, is bring out like the utopian elements and something that might otherwise be questionable and sort of ride that edge between them. And we were going to look for potentially utopian elements of finance and utopian elements of currency and what it might do that's positive. And so we thought of the idea of currency as being something that actually connects people and flows through the body of the state, and decided that the only way for that to work was for people to have money. So we decided to just create money to give to people. So this is all well and good. These are fine ideas, but then there's the concrete step of actually creating a currency, and how we would do this. We floated a lot of ideas for how to create this. We had talked about actually stamping coins. This was when Bitcoin was getting off the ground. So people were talking about making a cryptocurrency and things like this. Whatever we did had to be something that we could make available in bulk and potentially just distribute to NSK citizens everywhere in order to be a part of the NSK State. The notion that we eventually decided on, that we went with, was this notion of taking existing currency and overstamping it. So there is a great history of overstamping with real world currencies. Like this is something that has happened for different purposes in time. Here we have an example of a 10 shilling note. We were trying to be very localized in this presentation. So here, you may have seen a 10 shilling note before, I don't know. And in this case, it's been overstamped for a particular purpose. It was overstamped for soldiers who were in the Dardanelles, and then also used in Gallipoli, I think, and Palestine. But it was a regular note that would be used, in England in normal cases, but then overstamped, stating exactly how much it was worth in the local currency so that it could actually effectively be used locally as currency as well. So this was one example of overstamping. Another fairly typical use of overstamping was occupation. So there are many examples. For example, when Germany occupied, which one's the usual note? I'm blanking. What's a German occupation note? I can't think of which note it was specifically. Yeah, it might have been Serbian, I think, actually. They would, instead of, so when an occupying power takes over a place, there's a number of things that they have to kind of actually run the place. They have to actually serve the role of a government. And initially, if they're doing it right, this would include things like making sure that there's like running water, making sure the infrastructure works and electricity is up and these sorts of things. Somewhere down that list, you will eventually come to an occupying power has to actually keep the financial system running as well. Without that, there's you revert to a currency-less system, or I don't know, people barter, steal. I don't know. Maybe they make their own currency. And in order to do this, they have to have a currency system that will work there. What occupying powers would often do is, instead of having people bring in all the currency of the old government, which doesn't exist anymore, and so that currency no longer has legitimacy, instead of having people just have to throw that out and start with a new currency, they would overstamp that existing currency and say, fine, keep your existing currency, but it's now enforced by the weight of the occupying power, by the occupying country. And so you often end up with notes that have been occupied, essentially, by being overstamped. This appealed to us for a number of reasons. We already mentioned the role of appropriation in the original collective and how they would take things from the past, potentially traumatic things, and introduce them. Existing currency always has some sort of heft to it, both conceptually and just physically in the material of it. And there was something about an NSK state presence in a note, a state which already has no borders and no physical presence, existing in the physical presence of a note that already exists. In a sense, being almost a parasite onto that note and existing in that way. And so overstamping was a very natural fit as a way of producing currency for the NSK State Reserve. So with this in mind, the next step, of course, is, okay, where do we get a currency? Where do we get something we can overstamp? Where do we get a large amount of currency? Where do we get a lot of money that we can now occupy? I mean, of course, we could say, okay, I'm just going to use like my own dollars that I have in my pocket. That would get very expensive very quickly. We needed somewhere we could buy like actual currency in bulk and overstamp it and make it NSK state currency. And it turns out you can do this. It turns out that there are some currencies that, due for a number of reasons, might be available in just bricks for a fairly low cost. We're probably all familiar with, the pictures from Weimar Germany, where people have like wheelbarrows full of cash, where they're using them as toys for their children or as, fuel for fire and this sort of thing. That's what we were after. We wanted like that sort of quantity. And it turns out that for the same reason it was available in Weimar, that is, there was this hyperinflationary period. This happens in other places too. And the currencies from those places can be found in large quantities. And one such place where this happened was in Yugoslavia before the war. So if you're already familiar with the war that happened in Yugoslavia, you probably know it for the genocide that happened, for the siege of Sarajevo and the 3 years that people spent under bombs and gunfire. You probably don't think of like what happened to financial institutions. But even before the first shot was fired, the financial institutions, the currency they had there was already being hyperinflated. They were already adding zeros to it regularly because Milosevic was just sort of cranking out so much of this currency that in the amounts that it was originally issued in, it became worthless. And so what might have originally been a 1,000 dinar note had to be reissued as a 10,000 dinar note, 100,000 dinar note, 100 million dinar note, in order for them to still have enough dinars represented by that note to be useful. So it suffered catastrophic hyperinflation. What happens to all the old notes? They basically they become worthless at some point. And it turns out you can buy them. You can buy just bricks of these old Yugoslavian notes. So by happy coincidence, the currency from the country that NSK was originally from was actually available to us. And so again, this seemed like a very natural. And this is what we procured and made available. So what this resulted in is the note that we have here. This was the first note that we created. I did not know that Milosevic was originally a banker. That actually, this is one of those subjects, the more you find out, the worse it gets. like he knew exactly what he was doing when he destroyed the currency. This is the note that we originally used. It's 100,000 dinar note. You'll see here on the note, there are some elements. We have the NSK sign on the right, connecting it with the NSK State. I mentioned that we had sort of conceptualized the currency as being something that would flow through the body of the state. And the heart motif is something that was already used in a number of works by Irwin, one of the constituent collectives of NSK. And so we appropriated that as well and put it into this context. So this also had a connection back to that collective. We gave it a date of issue. You might see next to that little cross-looking thing is actually a windmill, which was a stamp we used for a while since we were in New York, which was originally New Amsterdam. And actually on the flag of New York, you'll see that little windmill. That windmill is actually, that's directly from the seal of New York, the city, applied as a stamp onto this note as well. And created this first note. I would also point out here that at this time, we were called the NSK State Reserve Bank of New York. We eventually shortened that to the NSK State Reserve, or just the Reserve. Part of the reason for that is that there are laws in New York about the use of the word bank. There's already enough that we're doing here that is a little bit questionable, that we didn't want to run afoul of actual financial laws involving the use of bank, for which you have to be an actual bank and put up I think $3 million in capital and get approved by the banking board. And we didn't feel that was within our means. So we shortened the name. And so we printed up some hundreds of copies of this note. On May the 12th, the date this note was issued, we distributed this note by hand. On that day in New York, there was a Laibach show, again, the musical element of the NSK Collective. And so we were present at the show in New York on May 12th, distributing these notes to anyone who wanted them, hoping that some of them would get into circulation, some of them would go to NSK State citizens. Again, there's a certain amount of just willingness to try things here. And this was the approach that we took. On the same day, on May 12th in Ljubljana in Slovenia, was the opening of the exhibition Capital to Capital, which was a retrospective of the NSK Collective, a major retrospective at the Moderna Galleria. And we had coordinated with people in Ljubljana to also be distributing this currency on the same day in Slovenia. And so hundreds of notes were also distributed at that location on that date. And this was our first attempt at trying to create a currency and get it out there and get it into circulation. All right, so we created several. This was the first one that we created. We quickly created other editions as well, and distributed those as well. Before I move on to the next part, which is about distribution, we did already, as soon as we started doing this, we started seeing some sort of like emergent effects by doing this. We found out that when you hand people money, even if it's money from a virtual state, overprinted over a defunct currency from a state that no longer exists, it does immediately grab people's attention, and people really like getting free money, even if it's completely virtual currency. So we did see some immediate psychological sort of effect of taking over this currency and making it. Generally, the first thing people ask is, can I spend this? And much like with the NSK State Passport, which was sent out without instructions and without guidance for what you could do with it, you were basically told when you got that passport, like, good luck, like see what you can make happen with this. We decided that was the approach that we would take with this currency as well. That we would simply put it in distribution, and when people asked us, can we spend it? Our answer could only be like, sure, like you're certainly encouraged and welcome to try to use this. And we'd love to hear how that goes. And so this was the first thing that we saw. I did, a second thing that we saw was when I personally went to Ljubljana for a conference about the exhibition at the Medina Galleria, and got to personally hand out this currency in Slovenia myself. And a sort of startling thing came out of this. Since we had followed this sort of pattern of appropriation, which we had learned from NSK, and taking these symbols and artifacts from the past in Yugoslavia and reusing them, I think what hadn't occurred to us was the impact that this would have of people who had actually been there at that time and who had maybe used this currency at some point to see their currency made into an art object of this type, and to actually sort of like dredge up everything that happened to them as this currency was gradually, or not even gradually, rapidly depreciating in value and being replaced by currencies of multiples higher than it. And many, many people I gave this to had stories about what that was like, what it was like to have that currency debase in your pocket, how it went from being something you could go out and actually spend to something that they played. Some people said their parents gave it to them as like play money to use with their dolls. There were many stories about the past, and some people, even when we brought up a symbol of Yugoslavia, became concerned that we were actually trying to bring back that sort of government, bring back that whole regime just by sort of bringing back the symbols of it within this note. So by adopting these practices of the NSK, we had immediately seen some sort of unexpected emergent effects come out of it. So for a long time, this is how we distributed the money. We would just carry around wads of this currency, whatever edition we're making, and leave them for people, give them to people, sort of see people's reactions to it, and experiment it that way. Some people who were citizens, we always had an open invitation. If you're an NSK State citizen, we will get you money. So we were mailing it to some people. But we were really looking for a broader way of distributing it. I have a picture here of myself doing this, handing out the currency. In this case, I'm handing it to the Prime Minister of Slovenia, Miro Cerar, who was present in New York for a cultural event. And it was a unique experience encountering him and doing this. He was extremely reserved when he got it. He didn't react at all. I think he was extremely cautious about what was about to happen. I finally explained to him, it's an art object, we're adopting this, and he did express some sort of like amusement and acceptance of it. And then I made the mistake of reaching in my pocket, again, naively, thinking he was enjoying it, offering him a big envelope full of cash, which, as a politician, he politely declined. So we continued at this point to look for other ways to distribute the currency. And one of the things that we wanted to do was try to leverage sort of financial instruments themselves, or the mechanisms of finance in this project. So we already had currency. One way that actual governments get more currency into circulation is through a practice called quantitative easing. And what happens in this practice, it might be done differently in different places often, is that a country issues debt, they issue bonds, and in quantitative easing, they actually buy back a lot of those bonds to get more money out there in circulation. A bond itself, I don't want to turn this into a finance class, although I'm happy to talk about finance stuff. The way that a bond itself works is that when the government needs money for a big project to build a school, they will issue a bond, which is basically asking people to loan them the money so that they don't have to like build a school in parts over decades. They can build this they can capitalize this huge project right away, build it, and then pay back over time. And what happens when you as an individual buy a bond from your city or state or country is they say, we just need this money for a little while, like 10 years or whatever it is. At the end of 10 years, we're going to give you back the face value, the principal. So we'll return all that. But in the meantime, we're going to send you money. So there'll be regular, you could call them interest payments along the way. They're called coupons. And so this occurred to us as a way that we could actually regularly mail money out to people. Would be if they held a bond, then we, as a financial institution, we're supposed to actually send them coupon payments. We're supposed to send them money. So it would be a way for them to buy into receiving money regularly. The catch was we weren't going to return the principal. So in a real bond, you give the government $1,000, you buy a bond, and then 10 years later it matures and you get the $1,000 back. We actually were going to keep the money. It was going to support the reserve. It was going to, like, you know, produce currency and these sorts of things. But unlike a real bond, a regular bond, these were going to be zero principal bonds. Instead of, there's a notion of a zero coupon bond where they don't bother with interest payments. This was going to be a zero principal bond where we actually kept it, which is why you see on the bond here, it's a zero principal. Once again, we used overprinting. So this is a real bond that was issued to a company called the Pan American Sulfur Company. We overprinted this. There was a Leibach did a cover of Sympathy for the Devil. So in keeping with the sulfur theme, we have some images from that production. We have an example of constructivist art at the bottom, or suprematist art, which also refers to the use of the avant-garde art in NSK works. So you'll see a lot of avant-garde suprematist and constructivist art in ours as well. And we have half of a black cross up here as well. And the black cross is a suprematist symbol that's often used in NSK work. All right, so this was the first bond we issued, and this was very successful. People were very interested in procuring this bond, and then once they bought into it, they would give us their address. And now we had, instead of having to go out on the streets and hand people money, we could introduce currency into the system by doing it at regular intervals as bond payments to our bondholders. So I can't see anybody out there. Are there any questions? Is there anything I can unpack for anyone? I don't want to just rant on if anybody has anything. All right, I'm happy to continue. So this went on for a little while. We actually made a few different bonds. I think we created 6 or 7 over the course of time. One day, to our pleasure and surprise, we were contacted by a member of Irwin, one of the NSK members, saying that they needed to capitalize, that is, they needed to get a lot of money for a very large project they were doing. And they wanted to raise that capital by issuing a bond. And as the NSK State Central Bank, they were asking if we could actually create a bond for this NSK collective in order to raise money for this project. So this is sort of a dream commission, I think, for us to be contacted by one of the original collectives to generate a bond. And it was also a great opportunity to, again, sort of leverage this idea of an actual financial instrument in a sort of applied way at the same time we were doing this. So, I mean, we said yes, of course. The project was to create a NSK State Pavilion in Venice for the Venice Biennale, which I have pictured here. It was the pavilion itself was an installation by the artist Ahmet Ogut, a Turkish artist. And I don't want to digress too much. This itself you could talk about a long time. But what this installation itself was a passport office. So you can see at the top of that staircase, there is a passport office where somebody will take your application and turn it into a passport. The catch being that staircase could be rolled away, and often was rolled away, and you had to wait until the staircase was available again for you to bring your application up to that desk to get a passport. But passports were also issued here. So for this project, this was, again, a very extremely expensive thing to stage because they had to rent out this piazza in Venice during the Biennale. And so they needed to issue a bond. So the bond that we chose is the one that we see pictured here. This looks like something that is just a good candidate. It has these 4 portraits on it. It's a recurring theme in Leibach works, vier Personen, for people, which refers to either the band itself or the Beatles. And so there was immediately a sort of parallel and connection to work that had already been done within NSK. We immediately set to work. Elements we could have on here. Again, we have the windmills representing New York on the bottom. We worked with some existing materials. So there was a work by Irwin called L'État, the state. And you can see here the use of gold, the use of portraits, the mechanical elements on the bottom that we wanted to adapt into it. And on the back of this, and David, I'm sorry if I'm like blundering through this quickly. David, the other principal of the reserve could wax on much more about the sort of like mental process of discovering each one of these. We have a piece by them that uses the color Klein blue, derived from the French artist, what's it, Klein? Yves Klein, thank you. Which was a particular shade of blue that artist used that Irwin then appropriated themselves and called the collaboration with that artist. So it's sort of his signature blue that they would use in some of their works. So these elements were brought together to create what you see here. Meanwhile, we were also looking into what this bond was. And I don't know if you can read the very top line under that gold bar. Can anyone read that? Who doesn't already know the result of this? Anyone?
Yeah, I get the significance.
The what?
The significance, IG Farben.
Yes. Yes, this is an IG Farben bond. It's actually a liquidation bond. It's a bond for the liquidation corporation that was charged with dissolving this corporation. So again, we were interested in bringing in, appropriating things from the past, seeing what sort of story came with them. And we had accidentally picked up a pretty weighty object by bringing in an IG Farben bond. Is anyone here already familiar with the story of IG Farben? Can I unpack that a little bit? I feel like I kind of have to. So IG Farben was originally a dye company. They originally produced fabric dyes. So it was a big chemical operation. And in the, I want to say the very early 1900s, maybe in the 1920s, 30s, they became ideologically entangled with the Nazis. They became basically a Nazi organization. Whatever Jews were still involved in operating that company were kicked out, and they became part of the preparation for World War II. So again, before a shot was fired, before an army was amassed, there were financial moves being made in order to support that effort. As a corporation, they also procured patents. They also cornered the way that certain types of rubber could be produced, how coal, which was an abundant mineral in Germany, could be turned into fuel that would be needed for this kind of war effort. I don't want to cast aspersions purely on Germany. They actually procured part of Amoco in the United States, which was sort of an overseas way for them to actually in ways prevent America from preparing for war, and also to continue to have money being spent outside of Germany, where it might have been more tightly controlled. So IG Farben became this overarching conglomerate, which included Bayer, which included BASF, other sort of German companies, as well as I mentioned Amoco, a part of Amoco. All of it in the service of preparing for the war, and it did. It was very successful in this. It enabled the German war effort, and it continued to operate throughout World War II. And incredibly, Amoco in America continued to do business with it during World War II until I believe at some point that had to stop, but continued to be one way for them to get around some restrictions they might have had otherwise. In World War II, it turns out that the chemical facilities used to produce dyes can quickly be turned to making poison gas. And this was also the company that made Zyklon B, which was used in concentration camps. So again, I'll use the word naively again. We had picked up this financial instrument and discovered that it itself carried this tremendous weight of history with it, and this fairly terrifying example of what could happen in finance. I'd like to say that the story ended there. As I said, with Milosevic being a banker, it gets worse. At the end, I'll just rant a little more about IG Farben. We're almost there. At the end of World War II, some companies were rehabilitated. So I mentioned BASF and Bayer. These companies were allowed to actually continue operating. Some members of the board were found guilty and served some token amount of time, and then we're right back in business, being on boards for other companies in Germany. When it came to IG Farben, they actually said, "Yeah, no, we are completely dissolving this company. You are no longer allowed to operate." And they created a liquidation company that would sort of be responsible for taking all of the assets of IG Farben and using it to pay victim settlements. They used slave labor to basically expend all of this money that was and material that was already still in the company and liquidate the company. That was the idea. And what happened was just so much worse. It continued to exist. It continued to be an operating company, paying everybody in the company, for decades after this. It occurred to me at some point, why would a liquidation company issue a bond? So we've already established that a bond is there to raise capital for big projects. And it wasn't really clear why you would need to raise capital for a liquidation company. And the more I investigated this, the more what turned out had happened was that IG Farben liquidation company had in fact became sort of a slush fund of money and resources that were buying territory. They were buying property. They were speculating. It was actually this weird sort of investment vehicle. And there was always this idea that at some point they would be legitimized again and be able to come out of liquidation. And so people treated it as an actual business, an operating business entity. I think it finally went bankrupt in the early 2000s. So it continued to operate for decades. And I don't know that bankruptcy even has been resolved. So as far as I know, there is still an IG Farben Liquidation Corporation in bankruptcy somewhere, still showing up in courts and paying people to try to work it out. So again, when you appropriate things from the past, you're bound to bring out an interesting story along with it. The final note on this is that As we said, the original design. Here we have Schmerz Schmerz, Death for Death, done by Irwin and Leibach. This was what we appropriated to have the big suprematist cross in the middle. Again, it uses that Klein blue color. So again, just to put a fine point on what IG Farben had actually done, in the final product, you can't really tell from the slides. The shade of blue is slightly different. It's a shade of blue called Prussian blue that is best known as being the color that the residue of the poison gas developed by IG Farben left behind. And so we introduced it here in the note itself. All right, that was a lot. Anytime I'm talking that much at length, is there anything else about this that anyone would like to unpack or comment on?
I just noticed an interesting, I'm not sure if it's deliberate or not, but normally underneath the Actin Gesellschaft, it says zero principle, as in, and that's you doing, that's your deliberate reference, I believe. Yeah, nice.
I'll
I've
take
never picked it up before, but yeah.
You have a very sharp eye. I'll just say, as they say in Leibach circles or in NSK circles, there are no mistakes.
Yes.
We don't feel bad about how that turned out at all.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thank
you. Okay, so this was we've continued to operate continuously since this time. Just to show an example of another note that we did, a lot of the notes that we've shown have sort of German elements or Slovenian elements. A lot of the NSK work, of course, had these, and so it's a natural fit for these. But we were also taking currency from elsewhere. We were also using Zimbabwean currency, had hyperinflation. We were able to do that. And currencies go out of circulation for other reasons as well. Sometimes countries cease to exist. Sometimes countries change their currencies completely and phase them out. So we have some Belarusian currency in some of these. In this case, we have an Iranian note. And the year that this was done in 2020, this was the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus in Germany. And so we did a whole year that was sort of a tribute to the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, where every note would be a 100 denomination for 100 years. And we also used the slogan of the Bauhaus, which is what we have printed on this note, Die Welt neu denken, to rethink the world. And of course, this is exactly the sort of thing you want to take out of context and reuse in a more sinister way, potentially. But we applied this on all of the notes as well. On this particular note, it was interesting to use an Iranian note as a substrate because there was some tension with Iran at the time that we printed this in January of 2020. There had been I can't even remember all of the tit for tat that happened, but there had been a bombing of some American facilities. There had been followed by an assassination. I can't remember who did the assassinating and who did the bombing. Back and forth for a little while there. And there was like a lot of tension about, would this finally be like the big one when the United States invaded Iran, like we've been threatening to do, from time immemorial. And then at the end of it, it seemed like everyone just sort of lost their taste for it. So everybody sort of de-escalated the size of the repercussions they were making, and it just sort of fizzled out. And so at the bottom, we have in Farsi, the word, again, this is something that, I don't know, maybe looks sinister because it's in this foreign language and you don't know what it means. The translation is no big deal. Like, it's not a problem. And so this was the text that we have on the back of the note. Another interesting sort of emergent thing that happened here was that we have this, again, this suprematist work on the front. I'm going to guess Shashnik? Malevich. I did this yesterday too, didn't I? When Malevich was at the Bauhaus, he did this this image that you have on the front, sort of overprinted on the note. We really, really love the interplay between the geometry of Malevich and the geometry of the Islamic patterns. Like it actually becomes very celestial. So I think that's another reason we wanted to include this note, is it's just really beautiful, the way that that works with it. And you wouldn't normally, I don't think, counterpose Malevich with, Islamic art, but they actually both have this geometry that I think is very complementary. Another emergent thing that happens is that the Malevich turns into sort of an X over the face of the cleric that's on the front of this note. And in a parallel to this, when the Shah was overthrown in Iran, before they printed the currency that you see here, they, for a brief while, used the currency for the Shah's government, but with his face X'd out. So they overprinted notes from that government with the big X on the face to show that he had been deposed. And what we sort of, again, accidentally, there's a lot of me sort of shrugging and saying, who me here, but honestly, I don't think that we really got it when we made this, but we did sort of X out the cleric on the face here in a sort of parallel to that. All right, so this is another, again, just a good example of a note. Okay, so I'm going to give a pitch for the book. we're sort of on a book tour here. So again, we've been doing this since 2014. It's a project that's gone on for some years. There's a lot of, I think, continuity throughout it. We've really enjoyed working on this over the years. There is another NSK State member who has been a great collaborator of ours, who has come and helped us with a lot of the shows that we've done, as well as contributing his own elements. Jean Valnoir, who we have pictured here in front of some works that he did for the Reserve that are called the Unsung Heroes of Finance series, which is another interesting project. And one of the things Valnoir does professionally is he creates books. He creates art books, and he publishes books like this regularly. And he came to us and said, guys, when are we going to make a book of these years of work that you've been doing? And so that is the most recent thing that we did. We did put together a book that encompasses every note that we ever produced, every bond that we ever produced, as well as stories behind each one, explanations of the elements of it, and in some cases, some of our favorite cases, even some of the transcripts of us trying to figure out what to do with it. So it's really a sort of behind the scenes look at the Reserve and how it operated. And so it was a lot of fun and a lot of effort to put together, and it is now available on PC Press. The title of this book is Fiat, All Money is Ours. And the reason we call it this is because fiat, you already probably know the word fiat as this being the English word fiat, but it's Latin for let it be, and so it appears in context such as the Bible. Fiat lux, let there be light. And it's also a word that appeared in a lot of NSK works. Maybe not a lot, but at least a few. There's a song by Leibach called Fiat. There were plans for an opera called Fiat. It was a word that made its way into the NSK canon. And it also has a specific financial meaning, which is very congruent with what we were doing. When governments issue currency, they can either do it based on some commodity. So you can have like the gold standard, where they say, this is good for so much amount of gold that we have back in our armory. And this is what gives it value. Or you can just switch off of that standard completely and say, all right, at this point, it just has value because we say so. We're going to say that this money is legal tender for all transactions backed by the full weight and authority of the US government or whatever government. And it's a little bit of a magic trick. You've taken something that used to have like a table under it and just whisked away the table, and it stays up. And when people talk about money, this is something that they often, is like the first revelation they have. It's like, it's all made up, it's not real. And it's like, yes, money is a social construct. And so this is the meaning of fiat. A fiat currency is one that only has value because of this. So we decided to, we use the word fiat a lot in our works, and we made it the title of this book. The other half of the title, All Money is Ours, is derived from a work by Miled Stilinovic, a Croatian artist who is very foundational, I think, within art of that period. And one of the pieces that he did here, you see here, he has scraps of money, again, appropriated, reused within this. And the text says, all money is dirty, all money is ours. And this, I think, really spoke to us in a way as well. The notion that like money is not some magical thing with supernatural powers. It's literally created by us as a society, and we can have it mean whatever we want, and we can adjust it and its usage in any way we as a society would like to, instead of treating it as something that happens to us. And so I think that this also is a strong underpinning of what we do as a reserve, is sort of taking control of that element and just playing with it and seeing what we can do with it, which lends to the title FIAT, All Money is Ours. The last thing that we have here, and if anybody, typically at a talk, we conclude the talk by giving everybody money, which is our thank you for staying around for the whole talk. This is a virtual talk, but if anyone would like money, we have printed up an edition. Actually, do we have any notes like? I do. You're right, I got it. I got it. We have printed up notes, especially to commemorate this particular bout of talks. So we're giving one, we gave one yesterday here in Bristol. We're giving one tomorrow at the Horse Hospital in London, where these will also be available. We've created this currency especially for this particular series of talks. Since we're going to be in England, we wanted to have something representing Europe. This is where you're supposed to laugh and go, Charles. Yes, that's the joke. This is the Europa and the bull. The bull, of course, is also a symbol that's often used in finance for being rising markets. And markets have been sort of like recovering lately. So having the bull there is also a little bit timely. On the other side of it, thank you. I'm afraid to say it now. Ilya Cheshnik, another supremated artist. We have a pattern of his. The trick being, in this case, that we actually turned it upside down. So the triangle is pointing up, which is now making it sort of more congruent with that, the bull that appears there. And the substrate is our favorite. It's a Yugoslavian dinar, 20,000 dinar note. On the back of it, name of the book, and a list of the places where we're going to be speaking. So I will literally send you one of these. So definitely reach out. Let me go back to the screen for just a second. So, and then the last thing I'll have here is just sharing this. Is just a look at the inside of the book. The one thing I don't have is just, I'll put it in the chat, is like PC Press is the way that you would order it. I should have a link ready to just paste in, but I don't. If you could, that'd be great. You're on the chat, right? Okay, good. So David's going to put a link in the chat, but that's the title of it. So you can find it there. And that's basically the story of the reserve up to this date. So I open the floor to questions, comments on anything that we would like to dig more into about this.
So I have things to ask. I will hold off for a second so I don't.
Well, why don't you ask one to get it started, and then we can.
Okay. Well, one of the things I find quite interesting is if you look at sort of, let's say the earlier periods of all the NSK collectives, there's a quite tightly knit sort of series of references, right? In terms of artists and histories, and it's all very sort of like all very interconnected. And what I find, one of the things I find interesting, it's not just the reserve, but when you take something that's actually quite overlapping and developed over 30 years by a certain set of artists, and then branch that out so it becomes much more participatory, to have thousands of people who could be doing other things, drawing on it, but also pushing it in other directions. And I find that quite interesting because I'm not actually familiar with many sort of, art movements or art histories that start as a sort of tightly woven set and then sort of say, hey, what do you want to do? And then sort of like make it something much bigger, right?
It does really open it up. I mean, art movements have certainly, we've certainly seen art movements before that have like expanded to encompass a lot of people and even been formalized in a sort of way. And I'm thinking of like the suprematists in Italy, or the futurists rather in Italy, had very well staged, like sort of groups across the country that all sort of work together. But yeah, in this case, just opening up, first of all, the citizenry, opening that up to anyone. Like if you look at the application, it's there's not much gatekeeping going on there. I think I've heard Miran say, like, you basically have to volunteer if you want to be persona non grata. Like you have to actually say, I would like to be persona non grata. Like, fine, you don't get a pen. But other than that, it is like just a remarkably open, globally open sort of application, which has led to its own stories as well, of course.
Well, I suppose one of the things I find what's interesting about it is that if one of the, as you said, one of the most sort of big NSK focuses is sort of excavating and dealing with repressed historical trauma. One of the most interesting ways to get to that is the role that financial institutions have in how that operates. So by choosing financial objects, you're like actually getting to that in a way which is actually quite clever.
I would like to say it was clever if we had planned it that way. Again, like just the having to end up with currencies that had been hyperinflated, and just like that was because we had to. That was because these were the ones that we could buy in bulk. And it just also so happens that those are kind of the most interesting, like they all represent a story of something weird that happened, and something that, carries its own weight. So, but even deeper than that, I think that it turns out that this is what this toolkit does. This is what the NSK toolkit does. When you work with appropriation, I think this is like an emergent thing that's going to happen. That's why what? Yeah, yes. So we finally recently got our hands on Venezuelan bolivars, which had eluded us for a long time because they're embargoed here. You can't normally get them. But if you look at we finally got to print on those, and by having a Venezuelan bolivar, even before we started printing, people were making art with them in Venezuela because they were as commentary on what was going on with inflation. I don't have it here, but there's a very famous photo going back, I want to say it was like at least 15 years ago, of somebody holding an empanada and using a bolivar as a napkin, because it was literally cheaper to do that than to buy a napkin. And this was a very famous photo, like in the press for a while, talking about the inflation there. So it turns out there's actually like some good history of, introducing currency as a way of bringing out these stories. So yeah, no, it is nice to work. Are there any members of the business school or finance? I'd love to talk about financial stuff too. So if anyone wants to dive in on that, or art history, that's also good.
Go for it.
I'm not. I am in the business school, but I'm a literature scholar, and I know nothing about finance or art history for that matter.
That's fine. We're here for you.
But I do have a question. I'm interested, and I found that very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm interested in, when you opened, you talked about the notion that that some of the point of the project was to investigate the utopian possibilities of money. And so
Yes.
I'm very interested in how you reflect on that now, when a little bit as you were just discussing, but as you were discussing all the way through your presentation, the sort of the repressed trauma of history returns all the time with the physical object. And so how did that play out for you? Where does the utopian element go, and what do you think about that?
You're absolutely right. It's the way it makes me feel is that if you want to have utopia, you have to keep being mindlessly hopeful, even if you keep countering these repressed traumas, and keep doing the utopian things you want to do, like circulating money to people who should have it because they're in the state, and operating in this way that the utopia will still be like in the direction you're going towards, even though everything you're doing is turning over these rocks and just like revealing things that are not utopian. So I think that's how it's affected me personally. Sort of conceptually, it is sort of hard to rectify those. I mean, we have. I think that finance works in a most utopian way when it works well, and that's never an interesting story. I think it's just boring when finance works well. And so I worked at so when I started working at this, I normally don't talk about where I work because I don't want that to sound like I'm representing them in any way. So I don't work at this place anymore, but I used to work at Bloomberg, which is a huge financial company, and they're global. And when you hear, I was also sort of inspired when I would be in the same room as the chairman of the board of Bloomberg, because he will talk about these things in a very utopian way. He will talk about how any time that a new country is setting up financial infrastructure, or a country that's leveling up its financial infrastructure, anytime one of them builds an exchange, anytime one of them wants to become part of the global network of exchange and finance, they have to get Bloomberg involved to be on site and connect them. Like literally, one of the roles of the company is to show up when people are building these exchanges, to have on-site servers so that their data can actually get out to the world, so that people can interoperate. And so that's very boring. That's the nitty-grittiness of this is very boring, but it does have that sort of result of connecting people and of actually letting a country that would otherwise be very isolated financially participate in a global system. If you don't think it's utopian to be connected, the results when you're disconnected are not good, which is why we have things like embargoes. And one of the first things that happened with the invasion of Ukraine was that Russia was taken out of, like, they pulled the plug on Russia. And again, like in this case, not before a shot was fired, but certainly an opening salvo of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was Russia being financially, and like not just embargoed, but actually disconnected from their own money, even being able to access it. So again, there was this entire dimension of financial war going on behind it. Again, not utopian. So I think that you try to keep the utopian element inside. You try to remember that it is good that people be able to access these things, and then you try to continue in that way despite what else happens.
I can't find it at the moment, but about 11 years ago, there was a point where the Ukrainian government issued a coin with Nestor Makhno, the leader of the anarchist leader of the anti-fascist partisans, on a coin. And I always thought that was utterly bizarre to have a state issuing a sort of a anarchist minted currency. And but I'm actually not sure if that qualifies as utopian or just strange.
Well, it's definitely like part of the cultural weight of a currency. It's definitely the images that we have on there, the things that are represented on currency, are kind of a big deal, and we don't think about them. It's just, this is what you have in your pocket, and you don't think about it. Until, for example, you try to replace Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And then suddenly everybody is extremely conscious of what's on their money and wants to make a big deal of it. It's very representative. So I'm sorry, you were, did you want to bring up that note? Okay. Oh, I can bring it up now. What did we want to, okay. Let me see if I can find that really quick. I got it. Okay, so one of the things that Dave was mentioned is that we actually just, in terms of within the notes themselves, utopia is also a recurring theme. So we have a number of notes where we have overprinted the back. We saw the example with FIAT that we just created. Here we have a note where we've used utopia as our theme on the note as well, as a hazard symbol. And we had a couple of notes that we did this way. So we have tried to keep utopians. But yeah, it's a great thing you bring up about like who's on your money and what are they trying to do with that exactly, you know, does this represent who the country is? So, and thank you for the link. Cool. I have all afternoon. I'm happy to talk. Anyone? I'm still like chat about anything else.
Well, one of the interesting things about the overstamping, overprinting process, and it maybe gets around this being a problem, is I've discovered if you attempt to, let's say, edit visual images of money, that there are particular protocols baked into Photoshop, and I'm guessing most other design programs, where anything that comes even close to being suspected it might be like currency tampering or counterfeiting is immediately blocked off and prevented.
Are you sure you don't want to talk? You should talk.
Hi, everyone. I'm David. Yes, just the physical act of scanning many banknotes at high resolution will create a system shutdown. There is a warning message that will pop up saying that you are in violation of XYZ laws by scanning this currency, and then Photoshop will actually shut down. Like the program will freeze and shut down, which of course just startled me a bit the very first time I did it, and I was doing it with a facsimile of a euro note. And so it wasn't even the real note, but it had a close enough semblance of the currency to trigger the alarm, and it just shut it down. I surprisingly did not get a phone call from Interpol after that, which I was waiting for at my IP address. But even just scanning the notes themselves will be enough to trigger those alarms.
Mm. But it's interesting that I'm just thinking about what is the state and what is the force of law in a very particular way, and which one of the NSK things is to point out sort of how it's always performative and theatrical. But it's interesting when sort of law becomes baked into the operations of code itself.
Are you talking?
No.
Sorry, your thing. Anyway, it's I think especially when things like money are involved, there is a lot of weight given to sort of like operationally what's required in order to have money function, and intercepting counterfeiting is I think hardcore enough that they work their way directly into it. I mean, there's also examples of, I think of like, I don't want to get into all the industrial espionage sorts of things that have happened, you know, that did or did not involve money. There's a lot of both. But yeah, I can also think of examples where like IBM photocopiers were used to like, you know, steal documents from Soviet embassies and things like this by, you know, photographing everything that was photocopied so that it could be extracted. But yeah, sometimes it is odd, but sometimes there is that sort of direct application of the law within the hardware itself.
Did those concerns inform you at all? I mean,
Shoot, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
I mean, does like Photoshop freeze
Why
up
isn't my volume
like
working?
if you're scanning like a Yugoslav note from 30 years ago?
I'm
or
sorry, I'm muted right now and I can't hear you at all. Unmute your speaker.
mute? I'm sorry. So the question was, did any of those sort of like code-based concerns inform like how you work, in the sense of like, obviously it's probably if you're working with current currency, right? But if you're talking about like, you know, a Yugoslav note from 30 years ago, I'm not sure that would operate in the same way. And or even very, very boring way, did it cause a problem like when you're trying to like lay out and design a book and you need to like tweak the sort of like, you know, the lightness, darkness on an image?
I think that Valdemar also encountered this when he was doing it. I also want to add that the physical currency itself and the vagaries and security elements of an actual physical note are sometimes a little bit challenging to work with. I get the sense sometimes people think, oh, neat, they just threw this on a note and it was no big deal. The physical material of a note is made for security and durability. And it's not necessarily, definitely not made to be printed on. For example, the waxiness of it, you know, so that it can survive these things is actually like sometimes a challenge. The way that the, sometimes even the security stripes in it are physical threads that will like get jammed in things and little things like this. So yeah, on a project like this, you do become very intimate with the vehicle itself.
You also become adept at drawing facsimiles. So if you need a template to work on with printing, you become very adept at drawing rough sketches of the American dollar, for example. One edition using one of two editions using American dollars. We literally had to like draw out the shapes and things like this so we could align our printing and know what was going where, because we couldn't photograph it or scan it and still use it the same software.
Yeah, exactly. Like normally we're able to start with like a scan of the basic note and then work out what's going to be overprinted. But if you can't even scan it, if your scanner is ratting you out and telling you, no, that's a dollar bill, you have to, you know, do something else. So yeah, it's been very interesting working with actual physical currency. Cool.
So I've been waiting so as not to monopolize and turn this into a chat between
We're here for you.
associates. Hello. And when you were talking about Bloomberg just now, about setting countries up, it occurred to me you could potentially start creating notes for states which are likely to exist.
Yeah, I mean that sort of infrastructure, it's like an interesting idea. Like what is the actual connection between that infrastructure and the state itself? Like what is necessary for that? And like I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know. Like, could you potentially have a node like that, like an exchange that existed outside of an existing state? Like, is that possible? Like, I think so. Like that seems feasible, and that's kind of the way that these more libertarian projects, you know, are going, is to try to have those sorts of, you know, with cryptocurrency or whatever else, these sort of like offshore or somehow territoryless nodes of exchange.
I mean, those would be fiat states.
Well, you could call them that. And that, I mean, if you're only the exchange, you don't have to worry about like imposing value on a currency. You're just sort of like helping things change hands. But yeah.
Also from a practical printing perspective, there are examples and some very good Yugoslav and Slovenian examples of notes that had been produced in anticipation of being issued
Yes.
that never were. And of course, one of the first ones that comes to mind is the Lipa note, which was destined to be issued in Slovenia. I'm going to wildly speculate that it was in anticipation of independence, but I don't know that for a fact. But I know that I've seen a few around, and they have the Josip Plečnik Congress proposed building on it, and which makes for a very handsome note. But it was produced as sort of a specimen, but it was never circulated to my knowledge. And I would love to do an edition on those, because they are sort of unrealized, almost utopian type notes. Another example comes from the 1950s. We did a small edition of the Yugoslav note that was never realized, but was proposed, that had armed soldiers on one side and harvesting women on the other. And I think you're familiar with that note. And that was one that was produced but never circulated. And it's still found in the, if you look up catalogs of banknotes for Yugoslavia, it will be found in there, but to my knowledge, I don't think it was ever actually circulated.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area.
Yeah, it's finding that sort of like connective point between like existing states and the actual currency. It's a lot. There's a lot going on there. Definitely, that's part of what we've been interested in.
Yeah, because you can follow the logic of the fiat legitimacy of a piece of paper. What's the legitimacy of a state that doesn't exist yet, or even an existing state? You know,
One of the
Scotland, Wales, the existing state that you're currently visiting isn't a legitimate state.
One of the things that comes out of it, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but that comes out of it, like, what is a currency? What gives it value? And it being a social construct. And when you pull that table away, what keeps it up and working? Is that, okay, I'm going to be very flippant here. Is that sort of confidence game of, will it be around tomorrow? Will they really back up the legitimacy of this currency? Does it really continue to be something that people will respect or not? And that's why you get hyperinflation, when people sort of lose that confidence. And suddenly it's like, this shit's worthless. Like, this government isn't going to be here tomorrow, or there is nobody actually backing this. Why should we continue using it? And that itself is an interesting story, like the way that confidence is lost. But what's really fascinating is when you read about, for example, Venezuela again, when they're trying to recover it, like, what can you do? Like, how you can create new confidence so that people do believe in it again. And I think in Venezuela, I believe it was Venezuela, what they started doing was actually creating, in parallel with their existing devalued currency, a second currency, same government, but a second currency that was sort of like the real one that people had more confidence in. And it worked. Like, it's working in a very gradual way. People are gradually migrating to this new currency that, for whatever reason, people are more confident of, instead of the one that they've seen get devalued over and over and over. So it is a very interesting thing. And I think people have started to learn this. I speak of like people in general. Like, there was always a talk about like cryptocurrencies, regular old-fashioned dollars will no longer be worth anything. But it turns out that, yeah, like when you have a currency with an army, it does make a difference, and that I think is, I've even heard from otherwise very conservative, like, financial people that, like, yeah, the reason that the big advantage of U.S. military power is that it keeps the dollar like front and center internationally.
Well, if the like linguistics joke is that, I a language is a jargon, is a dialect with an army and a navy. I mean, it's
Yes.
kind of a similar principle here, is that something is has value as a fiat currency because of that backing force or confidence trick, which that makes me wonder, and this is going to be a stretch here, but is like the ready-made in the Duchampian sense kind of like the fiat currency of art?
David gives you a big thumbs up on that. I think you've hit on something. I want to, Alexei, what do you think about that one? That one's great.
Can you repeat? I was just distracted there.
I'm basically asking you, is like the Duchampian ready-made kind of like the fiat currency of the art world, because it only becomes art because you say it's art. It convince people it's kind of like a similar kind of like, maybe conflict is the wrong word, but to talk about how like the creative act is also involved in the participation of the audience making things art, right? Like you see it and therefore you complete it. So there's a similar kind of process which it becomes art because it's said to be art, because it's declared through fiat that it's now art.
But maybe that's migrated now a bit to, well, there was an attempted migration of that confidence to NFTs.
Yes. Yes.
NFTs crashed badly last year because too many people were involved, and that affected the confidence.
Yes.
So the confidence actually depended on fewer people being involved rather than more people being involved.
So if there was less people and more armies and navies, then maybe
This is also very interesting math.
I think
go ahead, Alex. I'm sorry.
The issue with that is partly too many people involved financially, but it's also that people don't actually have confidence in NFTs artistically, and the producers don't have an army to enforce confidence in their aesthetic quality. Really extending your metaphors right well beyond breaking point, but
yeah. I mean, I do know with NFTs there was some surprise by people who bought them that it did not mean that they own the actual art.
Yeah.
And so that you would need an army. I mean, essentially, you would need like some sort of authority to. I just want to look at the chat for a second. Marina Lini, who I'm really sorry, I'm not saying your name right, says it makes me think too of states that should exist but may never exist. I'm going to not say this right either. Marina, would you like to speak? And actually, just like the hotness, Stony people issuing their own passports. There are other examples of people issuing their own passports like this. What am I thinking of? There's an island that was actually like sinking because of global warming that I think at some point issued their own, well, they would have their own passport anyway. I can't remember, but there was also some like political activity around that. But yes, it does have a lot of resonance with people issuing passports in that way too.
I was just thinking of the this question of utopia, and so and the question of here in this case using the physical objects of states that have existed but no longer exists, and so that I was thinking about it from that perspective in relation to indigeneity and decolonization, that the Haudenosaunee people issued their own passports partly as a way of saying, actually, we are on our own territory and we can decide where we can go and what we can't do. But of course, that state has never existed, and in a way it never will, because it's not a state authority that they're interested or invested in. But the issuing of those objects, in this case passports, is, as you said, is an important point of exchange and changing our understandings of what the borders can be.
There's an artist and activist, Michelle Cook. I won't. We worked with her a little bit. She's actually been very inspired by what we've done. She's an activist for Native Americans, and has done some very fascinating stuff surrounding currency and value. and was also going to in the mold of what we were doing start issuing currency. I won't go into all the details of that because that was kind of a long story that never quite came to fruition. But one of the roadblocks to doing it was oddly political, was like, if she was going to make a currency for a tribe, that had to go through like a council, that had to, the imagery, everything about it had to be like very tightly controlled and approved within that existing group with it, which I mean, as it should be, there's reasons for that. But it was funny that as soon as you started trying to do what you described, you also start to uncover these, in her case, these were power relationships. These were a council that she didn't necessarily agree with or respect, or felt was standing in the way of what she was trying to accomplish, but they still had enough power that they, something like this, they would be involved in. So as soon as you start messing with making your currency, things like this do crop up. But so yeah, that actually is a whole story. That was like an interesting experiment in currency creation. Other projects she's done, if you look her up, Michelle Cook, she does some really interesting activism involving money. At some point when she was trying to, I can't remember, this is my fault, not hers. What company was that? The case I'm thinking of, there was a company she was trying to get to divest, and she literally bought stock in the company so she could attend the stockholders meeting. And then, as you're supposed to, if you're a stockholder, made an issue of it. This to her was a mechanism of activism. And it turns out it's how it's supposed to actually work. Like, that's actually completely legitimate. Even for somebody who's I would hope, even for somebody who's like, a conservative financial person, whatever, should say, like, yes, that's exactly how it should work. You should get in there. I don't want to, I'll just keep running anyway. There's, you might be familiar with ESG ratings. There's something that was started a few years ago called environmental, social, and governance ratings for companies, which was essentially how environmentally aware, how diverse, how well managed they were, which has become a hot button issue for extremely conservative elements, that it's too woke, these sorts of things. Where you would think that like how well a company was like managed would be actually of practical importance, or how much bullish they did. And in any case, what's been interesting are the unintended side effects, even when that system is in place, of using that. And one of them has been, and somebody actually did like a decent study of this. This isn't just like somebody, musing. One of the unintended consequences has been that as companies get ESG ratings, say a petroleum company is getting bad ESG ratings because they're doing horrible things to the environment, everybody who cares about the environment leaves that company and involvement with that company. Who does this leave? It actually ends up with like fewer people involved in that company that could be doing something to actually change the way it operates. And so that's been an unintended consequence of what sounds like a totally reasonable thing to be doing. So it's again, I enjoy actually just reading the stuff outside of this project. So yeah, like I don't remember how I got on this topic exactly. I'm sorry, but yeah, involving activism of this sort, like into things like management of companies, management of currencies, how a state is run. It is fascinating, and how that pans out sometimes. But a very, very blunt, unfine point on. All right, Stephen. Like I said, I'm happy to talk all afternoon, but.
No, I think we've reached a good segue point. Yeah. So cool. So we'll do just to say thanks for that. That was super interesting, and thanks for coming along and having a chat with us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having us. Happy to come by anytime. So, Alexei, it was great to see you as well. And
You too. I'm sending a Serbian representative to your event tomorrow
excellent.
with two
Yes.
tasks, which you will be informed about.
Excellent. We will look for them.
And say
Very
hello
lovely.
to my usual associates.
Excellent. We'll do. Tatiana, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. Marina Langlini, I'm sorry, never got your name right. And to everyone who participated. It was very great to meet you all.